Cooper and Trooper's Grand Adventure. A Western Tale of Loyalty and Survival. Chapter 1: The Ranch and the Great Danes. The Juniper Mountains of northern Arizona sprawled in a vast, untamed expanse of golden fields, rugged desert plateaus, and towering juniper trees. The land was wild, raw, and breathtaking, sculpted by relentless winds and the unforgiving desert sun. At its heart lay a 400-acre ranch, a secluded haven of tranquility amid the rugged wilderness. The ranch belonged to Scott, a sturdy, weathered man in his late 50s. A former rodeo cowboy turned rancher, Scott had built a life of solitude and self-reliance. He ran cattle, mended fences, and worked the land with the steady patience that came from years of hard-earned experience. He wasn't alone, though. His most loyal companions were two towering Great Danes, Cooper and Trooper. The dogs were enormous, sleek black giants with a single patch of white on their chests. They had been with Scott since they were pups, growing into powerful, majestic creatures who ruled their domain with unmatched energy. Cooper was the serious one, always alert and calculating, his sharp mind constantly analyzing his surroundings. Trooper, on the other hand, had a mischievous streak, always eager to explore, chase after something new, or play tricks on his brother. Despite their different personalities, they were inseparable. Scott had trained them well. They guarded the ranch, protected the livestock, and accompanied him on his daily routine. Every morning, they would set out together, Cooper and Trooper trotting beside Scott as he rode his old ATV along the fence line, checking for breaks or signs of predators. Coyotes, bobcats, and even the occasional mountain lion roamed these lands, but with Cooper and Trooper around, nothing came close to threatening the ranch. Life on the ranch was predictable, peaceful. But all that was about to change. And it all started with a scent on the wind. Chapter 2: The Mysterious Scent. It was late October, and the Arizona air had taken on a crisp edge. The mornings were cool, the afternoons warm under the desert sun. Scott was making his usual rounds when he noticed the dogs acting strangely. Cooper had stopped in his tracks, his nose twitching. His tail stiffened, his ears perked up. Trooper, always the more excitable of the two, let out a low whine, sniffing the air. "What is it, boys?" Scott asked, cutting the engine of his ATV. The dogs were fixated on something in the distance, just beyond a cluster of juniper trees. Scott followed their gaze. At first, he saw nothing out of the ordinary, just rolling grasslands and scattered trees. But then, he noticed something. A faint wisp of smoke rising beyond the next ridge. His brows furrowed. That wasn't normal. There shouldn't be smoke out there. "Let's go check it out," Scott muttered, giving the dogs a pat before revving his ATV and steering it toward the source. Cooper and Trooper ran ahead, their powerful legs carrying them effortlessly across the rugged terrain. As they crested the ridge, Scott's eyes narrowed. Down in the valley below, nestled in the trees, was a small campsite. And it wasn't supposed to be there. Chapter 3: The Stranger. Scott brought the ATV to a stop and scanned the area. It was a crude campsite, just a small tent, a makeshift fire pit, and a few supplies scattered around. But what caught his attention the most was the lack of any visible person. Cooper and Trooper stood at his side, their bodies tense. They could smell something Scott couldn't. Scott swung his leg over his ATV and stepped forward cautiously. "Hello?" he called out. "Anybody there?" Silence. The fire in the pit had burned low, but there were fresh embers. Someone had been here recently. Trooper let out a growl, his ears flicking back. Scott turned just in time to see a figure step out from the trees. The man was gaunt, with sunburnt skin and ragged clothes. His beard was unkempt, and his eyes darted around nervously. Scott instinctively rested a hand on his hip, where his revolver sat holstered. "You lost?" he asked. The man hesitated, then shook his head. "No. just passing through. Scott didn't like the way he was acting. Something was off. He had lived in these parts long enough to know when someone wasn't being honest. "You got permission to be on this land?" Scott asked, keeping his tone even. The man gave a half shrug. "Didn't think I needed it." "You do." A tense silence stretched between them. The only sound was the wind whispering through the trees. Cooper and Trooper stood like statues, their golden eyes locked on the stranger. Finally, the man let out a breath. "I'll be gone by nightfall," he muttered, stepping back toward his camp. Scott studied him for a moment, then nodded. "See that you are." He didn't trust the guy, but he wasn't looking for trouble. Not yet, anyway. With one last glance, he turned back to his ATV. "Come on, boys." The Great Danes fell into step beside him. But as they rode away, Scott couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time he'd see that man. And he was right. Chapter 4: The Disappearance. That night, the air was thick with unease. Scott couldn't explain it, but something didn't feel right. Cooper and Trooper were restless, pacing the porch instead of curling up like they usually did. They kept glancing toward the hills, ears perked. Scott sat on his porch, rifle resting across his lap, eyes scanning the dark horizon. Then, a sound cut through the night. A sharp, distant yelp. Scott was on his feet instantly. The dogs stiffened, their heads snapping toward the sound. Then, without warning, Trooper bolted. "Trooper!" Scott shouted, but the dog was already sprinting toward the trees. Cooper hesitated only for a moment before following. Scott cursed, grabbed his flashlight, and ran after them. He had no idea what they were chasing, but he knew one thing for sure: this night wasn't going to end peacefully. Chapter 5: Into the Darkness. Scott crashed through the underbrush, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Ahead, he could hear the dogs moving fast, their paws pounding against the dry earth. "Trooper! Cooper! Get back here!" But they didn't listen. Scott pushed forward, his breath coming in short gasps. He wasn't as young as he used to be, and keeping up with two Great Danes in full sprint was no easy task. Then, suddenly, he heard a growl. Not from his dogs. Something else. A chill ran down his spine. He reached the clearing just in time to see Cooper and Trooper standing face to face with a shadowy figure. The same man from earlier. Only now, he wasn't alone. And in his hand was a hunting knife. Scott's grip on his rifle tightened. "Step away from my dogs," he said, his voice like steel. The man turned, his eyes wild. And then, everything happened at once. Chapter 6: The Standoff in the Clearing. Scott's heart pounded as he stared down the man standing across from him. The firelight flickered in the stranger's wild eyes, casting eerie shadows on his face. He gripped the hunting knife tightly, his posture tense, as if debating his next move. Cooper and Trooper stood in front of Scott, their hackles raised, deep growls rumbling in their throats. The air between them was thick with tension. Scott kept his rifle steady, his voice firm but calm. "Put the knife down, friend. You don't want to do this." The man didn't move. His eyes darted to the Great Danes, their massive forms like sentinels in the night. He swallowed hard, the realization dawning that he was outmatched. Then, with a sharp exhale, he lowered the knife. "I ain't looking for trouble," he muttered. Scott didn't lower his rifle. "Could have fooled me." The man hesitated, then took a cautious step back. Just got spooked," he said. "Thought something was sneaking up on me. Turns out it was just your dogs." Scott didn't believe a word of it. His gut told him this man was up to something. Cooper let out another low growl, and the stranger visibly flinched. Scott finally lowered his rifle, but only slightly. You said you'd be gone by nightfall. Looks like you're still here. The man let out a nervous chuckle. Storm rolled in. Figured I'd wait it out. Scott glanced up at the sky. The storm had already passed. Liar. He exhaled slowly, making a decision. You got till sunrise, he said. Then I better not see you on my land again. The man nodded quickly, shuffling backward. Understood. Scott didn't take his eyes off him as he backed away into the darkness. Only when the sound of rustling brush had completely faded did he let out a breath. Trooper gave a bark, as if to say, "You sure we should have let him go?" Scott sighed. "I don't trust him either, boy." He knelt down, scratching both dogs behind their ears. "Good work, both of you. Let's head home." But deep in his gut, Scott knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chapter 7, Vanished. Morning came with a cold, crisp breeze. Scott's instincts had kept him up most of the night, rifle by his side, listening for anything unusual. But the land was quiet. Too quiet. By the time the sun crested over the mountains, Scott was already out checking his fences. He half expected to find signs that the stranger had been lurking around, but there was nothing. No footprints. No disturbances. Maybe the man had actually left. Still, Scott wasn't taking any chances. "Come on, boys," he said, patting his thigh. Cooper and Trooper fell into step beside him, their ears alert, their eyes scanning the terrain. They rode out toward the western edge of the property, where Scott had last seen the man's camp. But when they arrived, something was off. The camp was gone. The fire pit had been stomped out, the tent and supplies vanished. Not a single trace remained, except for one thing. A knife. It was jammed into the trunk of a tree, its blade buried deep into the wood. Scott frowned, stepping closer. The blade gleamed in the morning light. It wasn't the same knife the man had been holding last night. This one was bigger. And it was stuck into the tree at chest height, like a message. Scott's grip tightened on his rifle. "Looks like he left us a little present," he muttered. Cooper sniffed at the base of the tree, his body tense. Trooper let out a low, warning growl. Scott pulled the knife free and turned it over in his hand. It was military grade, the kind carried by survivalists, or someone planning to live off the grid. The man hadn't just been passing through. He was planning something. And Scott had a bad feeling it involved his ranch. Chapter 8, The Trail. Scott decided he wasn't going to wait around for trouble to find him. He was going to find it first. He knelt down, running his fingers through the dirt where the camp had been. It was subtle, but he could make out faint tracks leading toward the north ridge. "Let's see where our friend ran off to," he said, mounting his ATV. "Come on, boys." The Great Danes needed no encouragement. They bounded ahead, their powerful legs carrying them up the rugged hillside. The trail was faint, but Scott knew these lands like the back of his hand. He followed the signs, broken twigs, overturned stones, disturbed patches of earth. The man had tried to cover his tracks, but he hadn't been careful enough. Then, about a mile into the hills, Cooper suddenly stopped. His ears twitched. His body stiffened. Scott cut the engine. "What is it, boy?" Trooper circled ahead, sniffing the air. Then, from the distance, a gunshot. The sound echoed through the hills, sharp and unmistakable. Scott's heart jumped. He instinctively dropped behind a boulder, raising his rifle. The dogs froze, their ears pinned back. Another shot rang out. It was farther away this time, but it wasn't aimed at them. Scott listened. Then, he heard something else. Shouting. Someone was out there. And they were in trouble. Chapter 9, The Rescue. Scott wasted no time. He revved the ATV and tore up the hill, kicking up dust and gravel. The dogs ran beside him, their powerful strides keeping pace. As they crested the ridge, Scott spotted the source of the commotion. A young woman, no older than 20, was sprinting across the rocky terrain, her face pale with terror. Behind her, a man was chasing her. Scott recognized him instantly. The stranger from the campsite. And in his hand, a gun. Scott didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The man skidded to a stop, his head snapping toward Scott. Cooper and Trooper charged ahead, barking furiously. The man hesitated, his grip tightening on the gun. Scott leveled his rifle at him. "Drop it," he ordered. The man's jaw clenched. For a second, Scott thought he was going to make a stupid decision. Then, with a frustrated grunt, he dropped the gun. Trooper lunged, knocking him to the ground. Cooper stood over him, teeth bared, a deep growl rumbling from his chest. Scott approached slowly, keeping his rifle trained on the man. The young woman collapsed onto her knees, gasping for breath. Scott kept his voice calm but firm. "You okay, miss?" She nodded shakily. "He kidnapped me. Kept me in a cabin up in the hills. I escaped, he chased me." Scott's eyes darkened. He looked down at the man pinned beneath his dogs. "You messed with the wrong ranch," Scott said coldly. The man swallowed hard. Chapter 10, Justice in the Desert. The desert sun was climbing higher in the sky, casting long shadows over the rocky terrain. The man lay motionless on the ground, pinned by the sheer weight of Cooper and Trooper, who weren't about to let him move. His breath came in ragged bursts, his face pale with fear as he stared up at Scott, who kept his rifle aimed at him. The young woman still sat on her knees a few feet away, trembling as she clutched her arms. Scott turned his sharp gaze toward her. "What's your name?" She swallowed hard. "Emily," she managed, still catching her breath. Scott nodded. "Emily, you said he kidnapped you. How long were you out here?" Her hands gripped her sleeves. 2 days, she whispered. "He grabbed me while I was hiking. Took me to some cabin in the hills. She paused, her throat tightening. He said no one would ever find me." Scott's stomach twisted in anger. The man beneath the dogs let out a wheezy chuckle. "She's lying," he muttered. "I found her wandering around. She would have died out here if it weren't for me." Scott's jaw clenched. Cooper growled low in his throat, his lips curling back over razor-sharp teeth. Scott had spent enough years out here in the wild to know when a man was lying. And this one? He was rotten through and through. Scott took a slow breath, controlling the fury bubbling in his chest. "Emily, where's the cabin?" She pointed toward the hills. "Up that way. Maybe a few miles." Scott nodded. Then he pulled a length of rope from his belt. "Cooper, Trooper, off." The dogs obeyed instantly, stepping back but keeping their watchful golden eyes locked onto the man. Scott knelt down and quickly tied the man's wrists together, tightening the rope securely. "You move, I let the dogs take care of you. Understand?" The man gritted his teeth but nodded. Scott turned to Emily. "Come on, let's get you back to my ranch." She hesitated. "What about him?" Scott's voice was like steel. "We're taking him, too." And with that, they began the long journey back. Chapter 11, The Ride Back. Scott tied the man's bound hands to the back of his ATV, forcing him to walk behind as he drove. Emily sat behind Scott, gripping the seat tightly. Cooper and Trooper ran beside them, their ears twitching at every sound. Scott kept his rifle close. His instincts told him this was far from over. "Why'd you come out here alone?" he asked Emily as they rode. She sighed. I was hiking with my dad. We split up for a short trail, and I was supposed to meet him back at camp. But this guy," she glanced back at the bound man, "he must have been watching me. He grabbed me before I even realized what was happening." Scott exhaled through his nose. "Your dad's still out here looking for you?" "I hope so," she said softly. Scott's jaw tightened. "We'll get you back to safety." The man behind them sneered. "If I were you, cowboy, I wouldn't get too comfortable." Scott didn't even turn around. "You say one more word, I let my dogs handle you." That shut him up real quick. The desert stretched ahead of them, the ranch still a few miles away. But Scott couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. He glanced at Cooper and Trooper. Their ears were pinned back. They sensed it too. Chapter 12, Ambush. The attack came suddenly. From behind a ridge, two more men stepped out, rifles in hand. Scott cursed under his breath, yanking the brakes on the ATV. Cooper and Trooper immediately sprang into action, barking furiously as they flanked Scott, their bodies tense. One of the men, stocky, with a scar running down his cheek, raised his gun. "That's far enough," he said. Scott slowly raised his hands. "You boys lost?" he asked, his tone even. The second man, taller and thinner, smirked. "Not hardly." Scott's mind was working fast. These weren't just random drifters. They were with the man he'd caught. Scott looked at Emily. "Stay behind me." She clutched his jacket but didn't move. The stocky man stepped closer, eyes darting to the bound man behind the ATV. "Didn't think you'd get caught, huh, Travis?" Travis, the man Scott had captured, let out a humorless laugh. "Guys got big dogs," he muttered. "Mean ones, too." The second man chuckled. "Well, let's see how they handle a bullet." He raised his rifle. But before he could fire, Cooper lunged. The massive Great Dane slammed into the man with the force of a freight train, knocking him clean off his feet. The gun flew from his hands, skidding across the ground. Trooper went for the stocky man, his powerful jaws locking onto the man's forearm. The thug screamed, trying to shake him off, but Trooper held firm. Scott moved fast. He grabbed his own rifle, swung it up, and fired a warning shot into the air. The desert went silent. The men froze. Scott stepped forward, aiming directly at them. "You're done," he growled. "Drop your weapons. Now." The stocky man grimaced, his arm bleeding where Trooper had bitten him. He let his rifle fall to the ground. The second man groaned from where he lay, pinned beneath Cooper. Scott nodded. "Good boys." Then he looked at the three men. "You fellas just made a big mistake." Chapter 13, The Showdown at the Ranch. By the time Scott returned to the ranch, he had 3 captured criminals, a terrified young woman, and 2 exhausted but victorious Great Danes. He wasted no time calling the sheriff. An hour later, sirens echoed across the desert as 2 patrol trucks pulled up the long driveway. Sheriff Michael Brown, an old friend of Scott's, stepped out, tipping his hat. "Heard you had some excitement." Scott chuckled dryly. "You could say that." He explained everything, the kidnapping, the chase, the ambush. Emily backed up his story, describing what she had endured. The sheriff's face darkened. "We've been looking for these boys," he said, eyeing the 3 criminals as his deputies cuffed them. "They've been causing trouble all over the state." Emily looked at Scott. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been out there." Scott tipped his hat. "Didn't do it alone," he said, glancing at Cooper and Trooper. Emily smiled and knelt down, running a hand over their sleek coats. "You two are heroes." Cooper and Trooper wagged their tails, clearly pleased with themselves. As the sheriff's trucks pulled away, Scott let out a deep breath. His ranch was safe. His dogs were safe. And somewhere out in the wild, the desert was whispering a new adventure. But for now, Scott figured he'd enjoy a quiet evening. With 2 black Great Danes at his side, watching over their land like the loyal guardians they were. The end.